The corporate media, even though the Mueller report has been out for a few days, and as I reported, well, I knew it wasn't going to find collusion because this was just a ridiculous Cold War conspiracy theory from the beginning. It did find damning evidence, in my opinion, did show obstruction of justice, but you would think, oh my lord, this week is the 5-year anniversary of the Flint water crisis, and they still don't have clean water, which this documentary is going to show you. They cooked the testing. Think about it this way. Think about it this way. When George W. Bush, you know, landed with that, what was that, an F-15 or F-17 fighter pilot or something? When he landed and he was, dressed like he was a commando and, then declared mission accomplished, what you have, what we broke, what we're exposing in this documentary, what you have is Flint's version of mission accomplished. And I mean that seriously. You might say, well, can you really compare the Flint water crisis to mission accomplished? Yes, I can. Because what they used to declare Flint's water safe 1 year ago is based on cooked testing and data, which our documentary shows clearly. And if you're watching right now, if you're watching this stream and you've watched the documentary, please leave in the super chat. This is a super chat if you're feeling super. Please leave comments on what your thoughts were on this documentary. And also, we want people to start tweeting using the hashtag FlushingFlint. If you've watched the documentary, we want you to use hashtag FlushingFlint. What'd you think of the documentary? Urge other people to watch it, that kind of thing. Whatever your thoughts were, good, bad, or otherwise. What I want to get across to you guys is this. I think that, this is now my 14th reporting trip to Flint. Majority of those were with the Young Turks, but I've been back here 4 times now since we started Status Quo. And it's very hard. I want to give you a little bit of the behind the scenes. It's very difficult to get people to pay attention. When I say people, I'm not just talking about corporate media outlets. I'm talking even about progressive influencers on Twitter and online. Because very tough to get people to remember this is an ongoing crisis. This never stopped being a crisis. And sometimes I've been criticized, like, Jordan, you cover Flint too much. I don't think you could cover this enough, frankly. Because this is about, do we live in a country, or do we, that is based on common humanity? Or do we live in a survival of the fittest oligarchy where if American citizens are poisoned, they are then left to fend for themselves and essentially left to die? And I think our documentary will show you very clearly that's what's happened here. But there's something else, and why I bring up mission accomplished. George W. Bush, and frankly Dick Cheney was really the president. George W. Bush was just, getting coffee for him. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney went to war based on false information, false intelligence in many ways that they manipulated. Testing and intelligence and data and mushroom clouds and all this business that were not real. They concocted a lot of it, and they used that manipulated intelligence and data to launch a war that has killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, thousands of Americans. The death count when you add in suicides of Iraqi veterans is high. So. But when we think mission accomplished on Iraq, we have a very visual picture. Bush landing in that ridiculous fighter jet or whatever, with the commando suit and declaring mission accomplished. Well, I am here to tell you there was a mission accomplished-esque situation that happened in Flint. That's the story we broke. If you're new to Status Quo, last year, Jen and I, based on knocking on 450 doors in Flint, talking to 150 residents, we found that the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, for those of you who don't know anything about the Flint water crisis, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality was the environmental agency. Each state has its own environmental agency. Think about it as each state has its own EPA. This was the agency that caused the Flint water crisis in the first place. They failed to add the proper corrosion control chemicals into the Flint River, and when the water was switched from Detroit's water system which they never had a problem with in Flint, to the Flint River. They didn't add the proper corrosion control chemicals, which by law must be added. It's called treating the water, chemically treating the water. And because they didn't add that, when the water went in, it was basically just acid water. And it leached on, it caused the already aged, very old corroded pipes to leach off lead. And lead went into that water system, and we all know what happened as a result. So all of a sudden, the corporate media covered it for, I don't know, probably Rachel Maddow covered it. She deserves credit. In the beginning, she's totally dropped the ball since, because she's obviously the leader of this Russian Cold War reenactment, this kooky conspiracy theory. The media went down there. I think they were down there. National media people were there for like a week or two, and then it was very focused on 2016. Trump moved down his escalator, and that was it. So there really hasn't been eyes and microphones and cameras down here. I mean, Ty and I have been here combined. I've been here a few more times than him, but we've been down here so many times, and it's always a common theme. There's no national media here because there's been a narrative spun that the water lead levels in Flint, the lead levels have gone down, and there's been a narrative spun that Flint is now back to in compliance, or Flint's lead levels are now back to within EPA regulations. That is to say, mission accomplished. Flint's water is fine. Well, that information that the media just breathlessly kept regurgitating coming from the EPA and the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, the same environmental agency that caused the crisis in the first place. That information was coming from 2 years, a little over 2 years of water testing, as our story detailed. That water testing was basically a group, started out at over 1,000 homes, but it boiled down then to 650 homes, now down to ultimately it boiled down to less than 200 homes. And these homes were selected by the State Environmental Agency and the EPA. So the EPA with the State Environmental Agency, these homes were selected to essentially be the focus group of homes in Flint that would be used. They would be tested consistently in several different rounds, and if their lead levels were going down over a course of time, then the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality could say, Flint's lead levels are now back to EPA regulatory numbers, which is 15 parts per billion for lead. That's a nonsense number anyway. The real acceptable level is 0, but that's the EPA's arbitrary level, 15 parts per billion. It's not even a public health level. It's a corrosion control level. Putting that aside. So how do they get these numbers? Well, the State Environmental Agency, according to the EPA, the State Environmental Agency was supposed to drop off testing kits for the residents that were on this program, the program I just described. It was called the Sentinel program. And those residents were supposed to, read the written instructions, test your water in the morning after the water hasn't been used for at least 6 hours, and take the sample, and then you leave it outside, and the state picks it up. So the residents were supposed to be testing the water, not the state, the residents. So last May, I was in Flint. Jen and I were in Flint on a different story, and I was having a conversation with a resident, and he just casually mentioned to me, to us, that the state had come by to test his water, and they ran the water for a little bit, and then they took it and left. To tell you the truth, the first time I heard it, I didn't really think anything of it. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head how the EPA mandates you test water. I don't know what the regulations are for water testing. So I had spoken to another resident who's become a really good source of mine, and I mentioned that, and she said, "They're not supposed to do that. That's flushing." And I said, "What do you mean?" "They're flushing the lead out. When you run the water," the guy told me they did it for 2 minutes. When you run the water first, you're flushing potentially high levels of lead out. So I then started talking to other residents, just residents I knew. I mean, at that point, I had been here over 10 times, so I knew enough residents to say, "Hey, has your water ever been tested?" Blah, 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 blah. So we got 2 or 3 residents at that time to tell us the same thing. Yeah, officials came in, they ran the water, and they took the sample. And we got back very low levels of lead. So it was already June. And I just, my gut had told me, knowing just the level of corruption in this state and this country, but specifically this state, it was still Michigan governor, Republican governor Rick Snyder was still governor. I said, you know what? We need to knock on doors. We need to see if this is more widespread. Because if this is more widespread, when I say widespread, I mean you're talking about literally cooking up false numbers, flushing residents' water before you take samples. What that means, that's falsifying federal regulatory water tests. That's a crime. Aaron Brockovich is on the record. It's a crime in our story. And why would they do that? Why would they falsify the numbers? Well, the only reason to do this would be to obtain a clear sample and report false information, she said, calling for criminal prosecution of officials that improperly flush water before sampling. She also demanded citywide retesting to begin and the reopening of the free water pods the governor shuttered. Quote, falsifying a federal and state regulatory compliance test, that is a crime, she said. Brockovich also noted that in light of these falsified tests, it's not possible, as has been done by many media outlets, to claim thousands of other cities have higher water lead levels than Flint, since Flint's real water lead numbers are now in question. She also said, flushing before a first draw sample is a violation. The entire purpose of testing the first draw means turn on the tap, put the sample bottle in right away. You take it as a first draw right away. The entire purpose of testing the first draw is to detect how much lead and copper have leached into the water overnight. Once it is flushed out, it defeats the purpose of a test. Flushing is cheating. So I want to boil this down because it's hard sometimes. You know, I've gone on shows and I've realized I'm explaining it in a scientific way because it is a scientific story. It's about water testing and, you know, lead levels and all that. But I want to boil it down, put aside science, put aside water testing. The governor of Michigan, Rick Snyder, his environmental agency that caused this lead crisis in the first place, his environmental agency that actually lied in 2015 to the EPA, they told the EPA, yeah, we've been adding corrosion control chemicals into the water when they weren't. That's why the lead was leaching off, because they didn't add the proper chemicals. That environmental agency, not only did they cause the poisoning of Flint citizens in the first place, children and adults, they then manipulated the testing and the data after the fact to prematurely declare crisis over. Let that sink in. They caused the poisoning in the first place, and then they covered up the real numbers. I want to be abundantly clear. Let me be clear. I don't know what the real lead levels are in Flint. If they did the testing the right way, starting tomorrow, it's possible that the lead levels are lower. The lead levels are within compliance of EPA regulations. That is possible. But the point is, what we found by knocking on doors, you know, old school journalism, which you funded, and you could fund more of that old school journalism. Statuscoup.com/join. Statuscoup.com/join. What we found here is essentially state officials going into poisoned residents' homes, and in front of them, knowingly testing the wrong way to get lower numbers. To get lower numbers for the express reason to say we're meeting EPA regulatory compliance, which is 15 parts per billion, and then right after the governor 1 year ago, now the ex-governor 1 year ago, declared Flint's water restored, they shut down the remaining free water distribution centers called water pods. There were only 4 left, but poor, poisoned residents depended on them for years to get clean water. Buying cases and cases of bottled water is not cheap, especially for people that are impoverished. Flint, last time I looked, was 42% poverty level. It might be more now. I want you to understand that what we found is a crime, but it's also one of the worst examples of government corruption and immoral corruption at that. State officials were literally going into people's homes with the parent and the child standing there, in some cases we found, watching them do it, and knowingly flushing away potentially high levels of lead, and then sending them a piece of paperwork saying, your levels are fine. What would you call that? I would call that endangering the lives of people that have already been endangered. You're further endangering the lives of these people because you're giving them a false sense of security. And why I'm doing this long build-up, because I want to play you a clip. All of this has happened out in the open. You want to know why? Because these state officials did not expect anyone to ever even follow their tracks. These state officials never thought a journalist or a team of journalists, Jen and I at first, and then Ty was with us when he joined Status Quo. They never thought the residents on this program would be talked to by journalists. They never thought that it would be uncovered that they were testing the wrong way. And that's why I always tell you, finding corruption in this country is not as hard as you think, because the corrupt individuals and organizations are usually sloppy because they don't expect anyone to look, because we don't have journalists in this country. We have paid stenographers. We have public relations professionals who put makeup on, are handed a microphone, and pretend to be anchors. I'm talking to you, Jake Tapper. I'm talking to you, Wolf Blitzer. I'm talking to you, Brian Stelter. I'm talking to you, Rachel Maddow. I'm talking to all of you. Think what we broke, what we found by knocking on 450 doors on a shoestring budget, thanks to you giving us that budget and all the resources of all these outlets. So the bottom line is, I don't have evidence yet, one way or the other, that the water is still contaminated. I do have evidence that the testing that was done to declare it safe, to declare it restored, was manipulated. More simply put, cooked. Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statusquo.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statusquo.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.